Hi, I'm Samuel from the Craftable PRO team, and in this part of our tutorial, we will tackle the most complicated section so far, and that's preparing the API. However, there is no need to be afraid. In the upcoming third version of Craftable PRO, we have prepared an API generator that will automate most of the steps we'll cover in this video.
A lot of what we'll discuss today is covered in a series of articles by my colleague Kristina on creating APIs for mobile apps using Laravel. You can check it out on our Craftable PRO blog. So, without further ado, let's dive in. We have a lot to cover. The first thing we need when building an API is authentication. To manage the authentication of mobile app users, we can use the default Laravel user model, which we've discussed in previous parts of our tutorial. We will utilize Laravel Sanctum and its API token authentication. This choice is driven by the fact that Laravel Sanctum is already integrated into our admin panel's package dependencies. We need to follow the official documentation for API installation. In Laravel 11, it's as easy as running the command sail artisan install API. For older Laravel versions, refer to Kristina's article. You can find the link in the description. According to the official documentation, we need to add the HasAPI token straight to our user model. We have already created test user in our previous tutorial, so the next step is to set up a new guard, user provider, and middleware for an example route. Let's get started. In config/auth.php, we will add a new guard. We will add a new mobile app guard. You could use the default web guard, but I found it better to create one specifically for the mobile application. We will be using Sanctum as the driver, and the provider will be user, just like with the web guard. Next, we will create an API endpoint that returns information about the logged in user. Sanctum automatically created one during installation, but since we introduced a new guard, we need to switch the default guard to the new one. We need to generate an API token for our previously created user to test the endpoint. For this, we can use Tinker to create a plaintext token. This method is available thanks to the HasAPI token trait we applied to the user model. We can test our implementation using tools like Insomnia. Open Insomnia and create a new request. The endpoint we'll be testing is at localhost/API/user. Just to recap, it is the root from the api.php routes file we created earlier. As you can see, it won't work without authorization. That's why we generated the API token. In the Auth tab, we need to select the bearer token and input the generated token. After successfully inputting the token, we are now able to see the user's details. This is the same user we generated the token for. However, since this is not the main topic of this course, you can find the exact steps in Kristina's article, which guides you through implementing GraphQL as well as REST API for the entire authentication flow. The link to the article is in the description. We will now continue with the main goal of this part, which is creating API endpoints for the models we created in previous parts of this course. Thanks to Craftable PRO, we already have models for training and exercise. However, you'll likely want to add an additional layer between the model and JSON response to ensure that the data format remains consistent and is presented in a way that's consumable by the client. The client, in our case the mobile app, may not always need all the data present in your model, or you may want to include certain relationships in the JSON response consistently. For this purpose, we can use resources, where we will define the mapping between the model and JSON response. Along with resources, we will generate resource collections. The resource represents one model, for example, one training session, while resource collections represent, as you guessed it, a collection of model resources. So, let's create some resources and resource collections. Now let's generate the resources we need. First, we'll create the training resource by running sail artisan make resource training resource. Next, we'll do the same for exercise resource. We'll also generate the collections for both, starting with training collection. And finally, for exercises. These resources and collections will help us format the data we send back from the API. Now, I'm going to fill in the resource and collection files. Let's start with exercise collection. This file simply tells Laravel that each item in the collection should be represented by the exercise resource. Next, for the exercise resource, we define how each exercise will be transformed into an array before it's sent back as a response. For each exercise, we're returning the ID, title, text, and duration. For training collection, it's the same concept as exercise collection, but this time we're using training resource. And finally, the training resource. This is where we define the structure for each training session. Note how we embed the exercises related to the training using exercise collection. We can also include a flag to check if the user is signed up for the training. To achieve this, we need to create a new custom attribute on the training model. First, we need to define a belongs to many relationship to the users, as it hasn't been defined yet. Now, we can add the new custom attribute called isUserSignedUp. This attribute should check whether the currently signed in user is among the users of the training. Make sure to use the correct card, mobile app in our case. I made a mistake here. Be careful. The function needs to be protected, not private. While generating the CRUD, we defined a relationship to training on the exercise side. However, we also need the inverse relationship to display all exercises associated with the training. Therefore, we need to define this relationship as well. Now we can finally add this user signed up attribute to our training resource. And we must not forget to add this attribute to the appends array in the training model. Now, let's create a controller for our API endpoints. We will generate an empty controller file using the artisan command. For now, a controller that retrieves all the training sessions will suffice. Here's where we will use the training collection we created earlier. Now, we're going to create an API route for the newly added controller method. Make sure to apply the auth middleware with the correct guard to protect the route. We can now test our implementation using Insomnia. Let's retrieve all the training sessions. Make sure to use the newly created route, and don't forget to include the API token we generated at the beginning of the video. As you can see, the API route is working and correctly displaying the data we have in our admin panel. You could see in the response one training session with one exercise, exactly as it is in our admin panel. Let's create a new exercise so we can verify that the API response successfully includes it. After refreshing Insomnia, we can see that our newly created exercise appears in the API response. We also need to add the possibility for users to sign up for and out of training sessions. For that, we need to create new methods in the controller. Let's start with the signup method. First, we retrieve the currently authenticated user by calling auth god mobile app user. This ensures we're working with the correct user from the mobile app. Next, we need to check if the user is already signed up for this training session. We do that by querying the user's relationship on the training model to see if the user's ID already exists. If the user is already signed up, we return a response with a 400 status code and a message saying already signed up. If the user isn't signed up yet, we attach their ID to the training, which essentially registers them for the training session. Now for the sign-out method, we follow a similar approach. We again start by fetching the authenticated user. As you can see, GitHub Copilot already understands the logic and correctly suggests the code. We check whether the user is signed in, and if not, we return a 400 error code. Otherwise, we detach the user from the training, which essentially means the user is signed out, and the training will no longer appear in the API response for the user's trainings. Speaking of the user's trainings, we currently only have an API endpoint for all existing trainings, but not for the ones the user is registered for. Let's go ahead and create an API endpoint for that. Now let's add the newly created controller methods to the API routes file. We will create these routes as a group so we can apply the middleware to all routes at once. We can also move the first route we created into that route group. Now, let's create some more demo data. I'm going to create a new training session called Upper Body Training. After that, I'll add some exercises to this training. As you can see, our test user is already assigned to the test training, which means they are signed up for it. Now, let's refresh our trainings API route. As you can see, the user is signed up for the test training, but not for the upper body training, just as it is in our admin panel. As you may recall, we created the API token for a specific user, in this case the test user. This ensures that whenever we use that token, the API response is always tied to the test user and the user is authenticated. We can also test the route that shows only the trainings the current user is signed up for. As you can see, only the test training is shown because we manually set it in the admin panel. Now let's try signing up for the upper body training. It has an ID of 2, so we'll need to use this ID in the route. Also, remember that the HTTP method has changed from get to post. As we can see, the user was successfully signed up. Once we've done that, we can check the user's trainings, and as you can see, the newly signed up training now appears in the API response. Next, we'll test the sign-out method. Again, we need to use ID2 since we're signing out from the upper body training. After receiving the confirmation message, we can refresh the API endpoint for trainings. As you can see, the isUserSignedUp attribute for the second training is now set to false. We can also check the endpoint for the user's trainings. The upper body training is no longer present, which is exactly as expected.
And that's it, we have the API ready and we can continue to our next topic, which is advanced permissions using Craftable PRO. As a reminder, as I mentioned earlier, we are working on an API generator that will handle the generation of resources and API endpoints for listing, storing, and updating models. However, we will still need to implement custom API endpoints like sign up or sign out yourself. So let's wrap it up for this episode and see you next time.